Hello all, my name is Daniela Waldvogel and I'm Chief Policy Officer at the Stockholm Chamber of Commerce, and I would like to welcome you all to this luncheon session where we will focus on the future of European downtowns. This last year, we have seen life disrupted in practically every city of the world. And the current standstill of urban life, of course, raises a lot of questions as to what our cities will look like after the pandemic. What will happen to our streets, our city centers, our downtowns, and our central business districts? What permanent changes will we see? What will bounce back to the way it was before? And what can be built back even better? Well, the discussion about the attractiveness of the city is, as many of you know, ongoing and quite intense from this very stage at the Stockholm Chamber of Commerce, where we often have local and national politicians, representatives from the business community, as well as experts on our beloved city discussing the development of Stockholm. And these discussions will, of course, continue as there is still a lot to be said. However, we are convinced that Stockholm and our path ahead will benefit if we open up and learn from other cities, other prominent European cities that have undergone the same trauma as we have last year. That is why we are thrilled today to be joined by four leading thinkers from all around Europe: London, Vienna, Amsterdam, and Paris. And they will share with us their predictions and their insights on the development of their city centers. And I am very pleased to introduce to you our speakers of the day. We have Greg Clark, Professor and Group Advisor, Future Cities and New Industries, HSBC. Gerto Udo, Director of the non-profit organization Amsterdam and Partners. Herbert Bartik, Deputy Head of Future Cities at the think tank Urban Innovation, and Vincent Gaulin, Chief Economic Development Officer at the Regional Urban Planning and Environment Agency, l'Institut Paris Région. A warm welcome to all of you. We will begin our journey in London today. So over to you, Greg.
Well, good morning, and thank you very much for the invitation to join this seminar. I'm really delighted to do it, and particularly pleased because my friends Herbert, Vincent, and Geerta are the other speakers, and I know they're going to say some very fascinating things. So I'm here today to talk to you about London. In addition to my role at HSBC, I'm also on the Board of Transport for London, and I'm chairman of the London Economic Strategy Group for the GLA. And just recently, I've been chairing an advisory board on the future of central London, and I'm a member of the UK government's task force on the future of British city centres. So these things we're discussing today have been occupying my mind very much for the last 6 months. I'd want to make 5 key points, and I'm going to start with London's backstory. From 1980 to 2080, London re-emerged as one of the world's great cities. And over that period of time, it added almost 3 million people to its population. Its economy diversified, coupled with the driver of globalization. Professional and financial services became key triggers in the global economy. And London emerged, particularly in the 20s and the 2010s, as it were, as a city that was on a transition, not just from being a corporate hub and a financial hub, but also to being once again a creative industries hub, a technology and innovation hub, and of course a great visitor centre with a very strong urban tourism drive, a renewed restaurant scene, a live music scene, and everything else. And this meant that central London, London's 3 central business districts, coupled with its enlarged central London area, became a place of great productivity, a huge concentration of more than 3 million jobs, a place where the delicate ecosystem mix between workers, residents, visitors, students, commuters, and of course, people who supply all sorts of systems and inputs to central London, in a sense, interacted together. People who were workers also went to restaurants, tourists also patronized the arts, students who came to London lived in central London, and this delicate ecosystem of interdependence was thriving and mutually reinforcing, producing all sorts of agglomeration advantages, the benefits of clustering together these activities in a strong city centre location. Of course, one of the aspects of this interdependence between the different things that happens in our city centres is that it also creates a kind of jeopardy. If one or two of those things become interrupted, it can have the effect of reducing the critical mass of activity, which undermines all of the other activity as well. And so as we come to our second point, the impact of COVID on central London is being very carefully monitored and watched. I would observe that there have been kind of 7 key impacts and 7 perhaps opportunities that come from this. The first impact, of course, is that during this lockdown, almost most of central London has been closed. The reduction of the lockdown actually begins in central London on Monday, the 12th of April, or has begun then, and we will see then progressive stages every 5 weeks over the next 3 months as we go into a phased coming out of lockdown and a reopening up of the city centre for all activities. But the medium-term consequences of the pandemic may well be more people working from home, increased online retail, increased use of takeaway and delivery in the way people eat food that's prepared for them commercially, a medium-term reduction in international tourists and students, a big increase in online entertainment, a decreased ridership perhaps in some parts of the transport system, and of course a big uptick in digital provision of services such as banking, health, local government services and others. So combined, the medium-term consequences of COVID may well be a reduced demand profile for the activities in central London, and I'll tell you a little bit more about how we've been modelling that in a minute. At the same time, COVID potentially produces some medium-term opportunities for city centres. They can grow their role as places of residence and habitat. They can expand their urban visitor offering to capture much more of the experience economy of combined activities happening in unique places. They should be able to focus much more on hosting innovation economy activities, which are, as it were, requiring more face-to-face and can't be easily digitalized. They will also, I think, grow their role in learning, knowledge, education, science and technology. Our city centres will embrace much more health and healthy lifestyles. There'll be a new agility in the way that spaces are used and a much more imaginative use of buildings to fit 21st century lifestyles and work patterns. And we've begun to see in London many of the stakeholders making plans to do all of those things. Now, when we think about how the medium-term impacts on London will work, one of the challenges, of course, is that we're only able at the moment to see a very partial picture of what's been happening. Let me take one example for you. There's been a lot of news in the media about population leaving our city centres and moving to suburbs or moving to smaller cities and towns. And of course, there are some observable and traceable evidence bases to support this, particularly in terms of the way that the housing market has been changing in the UK. However, the problem with extrapolating from these trends as if they are in effect a new pattern is that, of course, during the pandemic, the normal process of people moving out of big cities to move to medium-sized cities and large towns and rural areas has been occurring. And we don't necessarily see an acceleration here. What the pandemic has prevented is the other normal trend of people moving into the city, usually younger people, usually coming across international borders to do so. So London has seen some population loss. This has been widely recorded. But what London hasn't seen is what the effect will be of population replacement. Now, we've done some analytical work that suggests 3 different scenarios for the future of central London, and around this, a very strong recovery programme has been built. Scenario number one, we describe as a bounce back to the new normal. This is the optimistic scenario where, as it were, the pandemic goes away and we return to something like the old patterns of working, consuming, and visiting in central London. And in this pattern, we see that to 2023, when we're modelling this for, central London will lose about 114,000 jobs just from the wastage and the scarring that's occurred from the pandemic. In our second scenario, we think about widespread use of home working as being a kind of new normal, with many more people not going into central London as often as they used to, perhaps going in 2, 3, 4 days a week rather than 3, 4, 5 days a week, and if you like, flexible working becoming the norm. In this scenario, we see the rest of London growing its job space, but central London losing about 120,000 jobs. And then we have a third scenario that looks at severe headwinds, that if you like, the COVID-19 pandemic induces a kind of long-term recession. And in that scenario, we see central London losing 160,000 jobs to 2023. So there's no scenario here for the pandemic where we're optimistic about the short-term jobs impact for central London of this pandemic and how it will occur. So for these reasons, we've been looking very carefully at what's been happening in other cities, particularly cities in the Eastern Hemisphere where the recovery is already in train. And it's been interesting to notice in Tokyo and Hong Kong and Singapore and Shanghai and elsewhere, 90% return to the office, 70% return to the hotels, 80% return to retail activity. Coming to the final comment then, let me just say that the situation in London is in certain senses atypical. The COVID-19 pandemic has brought with it some other differences. Of course, it's combined with Brexit. And Brexit is a particular challenge in terms of London's ability to attract population. So we wait to see how easy it will be for people to come to London in the new immigration approach. The second thing is that we've had a very rapid rollout of the vaccine, as you will know. And as a result, 50% of all adults have now been vaccinated. So this is the backdrop for our recovery programme. At the same time, we have a UK government with a policy agenda called Levelling Up, which is about trying to distribute more activity away from London towards other cities. And then finally, we have some rather unusual opportunities presented by geopolitical scenarios, such as the possibility that 350,000 people may leave Hong Kong and move to the UK, in which case this would replenish London's population. Overall, the issues for London are a high level of uncertainty, a strong programme of recovery that begins next week, and a detailed plan for getting out of lockdown and for reopening the city. The key idea that we're all talking about is how to regain citizen confidence, consumer appetite, and trust in public spaces, public transport, and in buildings, and a lot of attention is being paid to that now. Thank you very much. That's my introduction to the situation in London.
Thank you so much, Greg. I would like to ask you personally, are you worried that the excitement and the buzz around central London will be lost in the short term?
Well, it depends what you mean by the short term, but, we will know a lot next week. In next week, our restaurants reopen for al fresco dining, and entertainment and live music and everything else is allowed in open air spaces. Over the course of the 10 weeks that then follow, we gradually will reopen nightclubs, restaurants, bars, and indeed cinemas as well. And we wait to see whether people will be keen to repatronize it. We have one idea that's often discussed, which is that in the 1920s, after the First World War, we had a period that we refer to as the Roaring Twenties, when people went out and had fun, finally relaxing after the First World War. And it created a massive surge in restaurants, cafes, bars, entertainment venues, as well as, of course, a lot of drinking of gin. And many of us are hoping for a new roaring 20s 100 years later. And the optimists amongst us, and that includes me, think that the human spirit and the human appetite for city centre amenities and fun is going to be very, very strong as long as we can guarantee safety and health.
Okay, so hopefully Londoners won't have to be reminded why they really love their city. Thank you, Greg. And over now to Amsterdam. Please, Gerte, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation. My name is Geerte Udo. I'm sorry, I think my parents never had any idea that I would have an international ambitions by giving me this name, but it is, and it's me. And if you Google Geerte Udo, there is only one. I'm director of Amsterdam and Partners, what is a public-private foundation for the metropolitan area of Amsterdam. We connect more than 850 partners, governments, cultural institutions, businesses, and knowledge institutions in the whole metropolitan area. Our main target is to build a better reputation to residents, visitors, businesses, conventions, talent, and investors, of course, but also guide our residents, visitors, business visitor, leisure visitors, conventions, etc., through the known and the unknown offers and possibilities of the whole metropolitan area in Amsterdam. The situation in Amsterdam, we're still in lockdown, everything is closed. We have a curfew at 10 o'clock till 6 in the morning. And well, as Greg already pointed out, it's a disaster for city centers. It really, really showed us a sort of a photo negative. So we saw very, very clear, due to the pandemic, what was going well in our city and metropolitan area, and what was going really not so well. We saw, of course, in the first part of our lockdown, March last year, that the most important part for us, and I believe for the whole metropolitan area, was to stay connected with our primarily target groups, so the visitors, residents, conventions, etc., but also to stay connected with our partners, because we didn't know what to expect. The only thing that we did know was that we didn't have a clue. So we really invested a lot of time and energy in all these kind of meetings to share knowledge, to share ideas, to share solutions, and also to share just the sorrows that we have for our residents, for the non-visitors, for the extreme harm that came to the visitor economy. And on the other hand, it was fun to hear Greg about it. We did have some profit from the Brexit. Because of the Brexit, the EMA moved to Amsterdam. That made it a much more stronger industry for life science and health, for instance. And due to the Brexit, there was much more fintech companies moving to Amsterdam. So we saw a huge decline in the visitor economy, of course, and we saw a growth in some other parts of the economy. And that is what I think is really, really one of the most important lessons for the whole metropolitan area, is the multifunctionality of metropolitan areas in several ways. The multifunctionality, if it comes to the economy, so it's great to have visitors. They inspire our city, they invest in our city, so it becomes even a better city for us as residents. But also it's very important to have a lot of other economies, so we have a diversification in where the growth is, and you can be more stable to the future. But also the multifunctionality in the city as a whole, and multifunctionality in city areas and in streets and even in buildings. Because we saw through the lockdown, and especially in the summer when things opened up a little bit with the restriction, that these areas that have multifunctionality were the most healthy in this crisis area. So we saw in our old city center that before the pandemic had issues with overcrowdedness and over-tourism, that there was really a problem, that there were not enough residents, not enough people working places anymore. The monoculture, of course, was totally empty and blocked down. There were no normal shops anymore. And we knew, of course, but now we really felt it. And on the other hand, you saw the same in the business district. that if a district only has a business function, it's not healthy either, because if one drops down, the whole dynamic, the whole social cohesion dropped down out of these areas. So it really focused us as a metropolitan area on being much more clear on making sure that streets, shopping streets, areas, and the city have a good balance of these multifunctionality for residents, visitors, and business people alike. Because then, if we make it much more functional, it will be more healthy, and it will be much more beneficial, as Greg also said, for all these different target groups. Because we really believe that the metropolitan area, wherever it is a sort of living organism. And it's more holistic approach, how it is connected with each other, will help us to make it more healthy, more sustainable, and more inclusive to the future. Because we also saw that this trend pre-COVID of bigger gaps between rich and poor, educated, non-educated, wealthy, healthy, and not so, became only bigger. And that is also a challenge that we're facing, I think, as metropolitan areas, that we really have to invest to see how can we manage to make it beneficial for this diverse group of people that live here, work here, and will visit. Because we are a city with 180 nationalities and we're proud of it, but we also have to work hard together with these 850 partners to keep it that way, to make sure that the livability growth that we have, despite the COVID pandemic, still 10% top on prices of houses. So I do agree with Greg that you see the trend of people moving out, but the housing prices are still rising. And I think as soon as the pandemic is over and cities, I do believe, will become more safe, more healthy, more green. We have, like Stockholm, better waterway, and I think we should invest in that as well. And that is the challenge, I think, for our future, that there is a lot of co-creation happening in this moment to make at least it better than it was before COVID. So we use the pandemic to invest in these more multifunctional areas in the city center, but also in the upcoming other areas. We build on a bigger perception of what downtown is, because that gives you more space and more functionality. And we're investing in all these other parts. And we have to in co-creation, because that's also what we learned a lot. If we do co-create with residents, companies, experts, and cultural institutions, knowledge institutions together, you get the responsibility back also at the residents combined. And like Greg said, to finish up, it is complex to look into the future. Nobody knows. I hope we will jump into roaring 20s. I cannot wait. But we saw in the summer when restaurants and hotels and museums opened up, that the first week it was booming. And then it dropped down because there is also a sort of hesitation. So there is this scenario we have that we will open up and it will go slow and step by step, because we have to open up, we have to learn and get the trust back that cities are safe and fun and inspiring. And on the other hand, we have this roaring 20 idea that it will go open faster, but that it will become harder for everybody to buy property, that it will become harder to, if we make these cities more and more attractive, we will attract more and more visitors. So that is a huge challenge. We're really investing, especially downtown, make the streets more diverse. We have a whole new plan on a different way policy on red light district, coffee shops, monoculture, more living, more working in the city center to get the multifunctionality back so everybody feels at home in our downtown.
Thank you so much from Amsterdam. As you mentioned, Amsterdam is known for being one of Europe's most prominent tourist destinations. However, you have been battling with so-called over-tourism. Will Amsterdam be up for a change in terms of tourism? How do you create a more sustainable destination?
Yeah, that's a good question. We did make within a co-creation this new vision and strategy on a redesign of our visitor economy for 2025. And we have to pinpoint out that it's 2025 because we have a new vision that is shared by residents and industry and culture and investors. So that is really powerful, but you cannot change a city center overnight. So for instance, what I said, the new change on regulation for coffee shops, that it will become not possible anymore in the future for tourists to buy in our local coffee shops. That's only permitted for residents. But before we're there with all the policy that's necessary, it would take a while. The same with our prostitution. Prostitution is legal, but we want to get rid of the red light windows that are more entertaining than service. So there is this whole process of building a prostitution hotel where ladies and guys can offer their services, but without standing before a window, in front of a window as an attraction. We have clear policy on programming shopping streets if it comes to much more diversification, because like Gregor's already said, we will do much more shopping online. But we also know that people want to go out, and shopping is also an entertainment for some people. So these streets have to get another multifunctionality as well. So there are a lot of plans combined with investing in other areas, guiding better, using data, getting more green, getting cars out of the city. But it's in hand of these 850 partners if we manage to build on this program. Because I know for sure in this summer, as soon as it opened up, the first visitors will be young people that are feeling safe and jump in their car and also visit our red light district because it's known for that. So yes, we have a whole strategy, but it takes time, energy, and patience and a lot of effort to really make these change in these old city centers, I guess.
So it sounds like in the long term, some urban experiences won't look exactly the same as they did before the pandemic. Thank you so much. We will go on and travel to Vienna. Vienna that was ranked 2 years in a row the most livable city in the world, according to the Economist Intelligence Unit. Please, Herbert, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation and for the possibility to be part of that discussion. My company, Urban Innovation Vienna, is a consultancy and think tank of the city of Vienna for future urban issues, and we're providing expertise and support for decision makers in politics, administration, and business. And my main field of expertise is strategic urban development, which directly brings me to our today's topic. At the beginning, I will say just a few sentences about the current situation in Vienna and in Austria, so you get the whole picture, and then I will move on to the impact on the inner city. We're actually currently in the third hard lockdown. Some would even argue that it's the fourth. That depends on your definition. Especially in the eastern part of the country, including Vienna, the number of infections is still very high, which puts a lot of stress on the healthcare system. Hard lockdown means that, except for supermarkets and shops for daily needs, all shops and services are closed. Schools are closed. There's a sort of curfew in place with some exceptions. Universities are closed. They actually never came out of distance learning since March, the last March, 2020. We have, as many other countries, seen waves in the development of the pandemic and a government policy on the federal level, which is increasingly considered erratic and critically viewed, therefore. And as a consequence, the government, which is formed by the Conservative Party and the Green Party, has significantly lost public support. In fact, Vienna as a province has some possibilities to influence decisions, but overall responsibility for legal regulations or lockdown measures, of course, is on the federal level. And the fact that we're just in another lockdown also affects public attitudes. We witness a certain feeling of fatigue and frustration, partly anger, and a decreasing willingness to follow the rules which are imposed. Part of the reason is, or part of the reason for the pessimism is that up until now, no clear path for reopening has been presented. There are indications that at least in May, certain parts of society and business might be reopened, but that remains to be seen. So there's a lot of uncertainty going on. What does all that mean for the inner city or the city center of Vienna? First, you have to know that the basic structure of Vienna, a city of about 2 million inhabitants, is monocentric. There have been initiatives to modify that characteristic, most notable with the development of a second CBD at the banks of the Danube and with the development of a business district right next to the new main railway station. But the historical inner city and its bordering neighborhoods are still very much the heart of the city and the location of most, or actually nearly all, of government agencies from the federal level and from the city level. It's the location. It's the most important business and office location. It's the location of the two of the main universities of the city. It has the most important shopping streets and is the most important tourist destination, of course. Obviously, in relation to the last, to tourism, we see the most obvious and immediate effects. 2020 has seen a drop in overnight stays of about 75% in comparison to 2019. If you just look at the numbers for February 2021, you see a reduction of 90% in overnight stays in comparison to February 2020, the last month before the first lockdown last year. These numbers, of course, are also a result of the fact that Vienna is an important location for congresses, conventions, and events, which have been cancelled altogether. And the question remains when and in which format are they going to emerge again. However, having said that, right now we don't see much of an impact on the hotel market yet. There are only 1 or 2 cases where projects which have been originally planned as hotels are now converted into residentials. These are projects on the fringes of the inner city, but this is not a widespread trend yet. And in general, it is estimated that inner city hotels with a stronger equity base are more likely to survive than hotels in more peripheric locations, of course. Switching to retail and office in the inner city, we know that there is a high probability that office spaces are going to change in the medium term, or to be more precise, that COVID is going to accelerate trends toward a new world of work concepts and remote working, which have been visible for a certain period now and might lead to reduced demand. However, this likely development is not yet visible in the data we have. Actually, in terms of rent level and vacancy rates, the market in 2020 citywide and in the inner city parts has been very stable and has developed according to long-term trends. Same is true for retail. In the inner city, we haven't seen major bankruptcies or prominent brands going out of business, but that is also due to the fact that there is a rather generous financial support provided by the federal government. And in some cases, agreements have been reached with landlords to reduce the rent level for a certain period of time. So there is a danger and a probability that the full effects of the crisis are just delayed and will hit us in the near future. When looking at innovations, because there was also a question of today's session, looking at innovations in the context of the pandemic, as in many other cities, food and hospitality have been drivers with positive effects for the inner city. We see all sorts of takeaway concepts, pop-up restaurants and the like. There are concepts of the city to provide more space for restaurants, outdoors, etc. So there's a lot of things going on. And all these contributes to another development, that is that locals use the inner city much more intensively to meet, to talk, to drink, to socialize. It's a bit like a rediscovery, actually, of the inner city. And in fact, during the second and also in the first phase of the third lockdown, parts of the inner city were rather crowded, which also led to some political controversy. But leaving that controversies aside, in general, I think this is a very positive development, and it also connects with what have been said by the speakers, because it can make the inner city more mixed use, more lively, more resilient. That's the positive side. In turn, it will put additional pressure on public spaces, especially after international tourism returns, as we hope it will in the next couple of months. So the inner city might have to accommodate a growing number of people, which means that our efforts to redistribute public spaces away from parking and driving towards active forms of mobility and recreation, gathering, etc., will have to intensify. And if we do this, if we intensify our efforts, I think we will also be able to better use the recent boost in digitalization we have seen in the arts, with museums, theaters, and opera houses streaming their performances online. So why not increase the possibility to stream and watch performances in attractive public spaces? Why not allow a semi-digital, semi-real experience of museums in public spaces in the inner cities? In general, culture tech is obviously developed into a very important industry that we can use for the benefit of the inner city. So to summarize, COVID has acted in many ways in Vienna and in other cities as an accelerator of developments which were already visible before. We have innovation in food and hospitality, we have changes in office space, new retail concepts like retail as a service, experience shops, try before you buy, etc. We have new forms of micro mixed use concepts, which all bring more flexibility and agility to our cities. I think the question we have to ask ourselves is whether our inner cities are prepared for that new agility and flexibility. For Vienna and its inner city, that means accommodating these new demands, business models, behaviors, etc., into an historic urban fabric, which amongst others is classified as UNESCO World Heritage Site, which as such is a good and valuable thing, but also puts strains on development options and can lead to conflicts involving new projects. So the city of Vienna is currently working on a management plan for the World Heritage, and my advice to the city is to follow that up with a management plan for post-COVID development, very much like Greg described for London, a management plan for post-COVID development, which defines the necessary framework conditions for the next cycle of inner city development and inner city investment.
Thank you so much, Herbert. I began by saying that Vienna ranks very high when it comes to livability. Why do you think that you outrank other cities? What are your real strengths?
Well, there are several strengths. First of all, Vienna is a very green city. About 50% of the city are green spaces, which means that nearly all parts of the city have access to high quality green spaces. That is very important. We always rank very high when it comes to the quality of our healthcare system, when it comes to the quality of our housing system. As you might know, social housing is very, very important here in Vienna. About more than 60% of the population in Vienna live in social housing, which is funded by the city and by the federal state, which gives us the privilege that our housing market is much less inflated than in many other cities. So that are very, very important reasons for that. Another reason is that our services of general interest, our infrastructure is in a very good shape. It is actually owned by the city of Vienna, or companies owned by the city of Vienna. And altogether that gives a framework and a kind of resilience which benefits the city and leads to the fact that we score quite high in terms of livability.
Thank you. And we will move on to our last stop, and that is Paris. The floor is yours, Vincent Gaulin, please.
Thank you, Daniela, for your invitation. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor for me to give this presentation today. I am Vincent Gaulin, the Chief Economic Development Officer of l'Institut Paris Région. We are a non-profit association financed by public organization, who 200 experts explore all dimensions of city life to help local decision makers in Paris region, but also worldwide. So, what is the situation in Paris region? Please, first keep in mind that the Paris region concentrates more than 12 million inhabitants and 6 million jobs. Since March 2020, we have experienced 3 lockdown periods, and the last one still in progress, like in Amsterdam, I understand, and maybe in Vienna too. So let's have a look on the bar chart first. While the number of jobs in Paris region was previously growing strongly, in 2020, in fact, we lost 100,000 jobs. The graph below indicates the differences between sectors. Non-market services, construction and agriculture won job in 2020. Maybe it's a surprise, but it's a reality. In contrast, market services and industry have lost job. The table gives you on the left side give you more precise information on the growing and shrinking sectors in the Paris region in 2020. So let's move on the following slide. First, keep in mind that Paris region lost more than 33 million tourists in 2020. It's a huge decrease. This had a very strong impact on the regional economy. More than 15 billion euro have been lost last year. To illustrate the impact of the pandemics, I would like to take a closer look on the graph on the evolution of frequentation of 4 types of key places in Paris region. Each color curve indicates the percentage of attendance for the category with regard to the reference period of January 2020. The green color is for parks and gardens. Hobbies, culture, and shopping places are in mauve color. The shop of essential purchases such as food, pharmacy are in red color, and places for work are in blue. The data refer to the period February 2020 to February 2021. As you can see, except parks and gardens, after the first lockdown, all the other places are under-frequented because sometimes they are closed, like many cultural sites or restaurants and some shops, or less attractive for people. Remote work also reduces the presence of employees in company by 40% during the last months. It's very important. Therefore, the city of Paris, the city center, in fact, has lost a lot of tourists, attracts fewer employees to companies, and loses inhabitants, such as in London, during periods of lockdown. The economic impact of COVID is even stronger. Some local businesses will not survive. This may ultimately reduce the variety of the offer of shops and restaurants by leaving an even more important place for international brands. For us, it's a shame because Paris could lose elements of its identity and variety. I move to the next slide. So now let's look at 4 key trends for the future. The first trend is, in France, company and real estate investors believe that in the future, a large number of employees will work at home or in a third place located in suburbs or close to their house. We think that this employer will work at home or in a third place for 2 days a week. This will have a great impact on territories, on city center, but also on residential places. The second trend is the crisis. The crisis reinforces the fragility of poor population in France and especially in the Paris region, but also the fragility of migrants. It's essential for us to strengthen policies aimed at these people, especially in the city center. The third trend is the crisis has made possible to speed up the deployment of cycle path, for example, in the Paris region. The connection with mass transport or mass transit transportation, such as regional trains, is key for us to improving mobility and also reducing carbon emission. Last but not least, public spaces. We must redefine public spaces to be much more user-friendly based on the expectation of residents, employees, tourists, elderly people, etc. And maybe it's like Geert said to us about co-creation between people and public authorities. Let's move to my last slide. As you can see on the graph on the corner on the right, in 2023 we expect to return to the employment level of 2020. The end of this crisis, of the consequences, of the crisis may be faster in Paris because of the 2024 Olympic Games, of course, but also because of a massive investment program in transport, the Greater Paris Express, and also in renovation of entire districts in suburbs. And so that's very powerful. It's an engine for the development of the Paris region. Several questions seem important to me for the future, starting with the adaptation of our city to climate and digital challenges. It's very important for the city center. It's very important also at regional level. We believe that the COVID crisis is transforming the habits of businesses and residents. Thanks to teleworking, there will be more people in residential areas during the week. To be attractive, that means that business districts will have to reinvent themselves to be more user-friendly. City centers will remain essential to ensure the development of links between people face to face. In competition with internet and other places, they have to intensify the urban experiences offered. It will also be necessary to fight against speculation and again also gentrification and tendency towards the monospecialization of city center. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you from Paris. We discussed with Greg and Herbert that the pandemic might have permanent effects on the way we work. But how about the way we socialize and entertain ourselves and play? Paris is the cultural city of the world. What do you see?
So we see first that, you have to keep in mind that 300,000 people work in cultural and creative industries in Paris region. So it's non-essential for food, but it's very essential for social life, as you said. So several policies have been put in place by the French state, the Regional Council of Paris region, of course, the City of Paris, to protect our cultural ecosystem. These policies are based on 3 axes: protect, relaunch, reinvent. Protect, both involved in culture through coordinated financial aids, focus on people, but also on organization. Secondly, when it will be possible, because we are locked down, relaunch attendance at cultural activities by restoring confidence to people who are particularly afraid of going to closed places such as small theater. Immunization of the population by the vaccine is very important, but not sufficient. We have to work on confidence of the population. The last axis of our strategy is reinvent. Reinvent culture by expanding its role in cities, in particular to strengthen social cohesion, well-being, integration of migrants, or even social cohesion. Of course, we must also help the cultural sector to continue to reinvent itself through digital technology. And there is still a lot to do in this field of activity.
Thank you. And now I would like to invite you all up to our panel discussion. Welcome. I would like to start with you, Greg. You have all commented on the fact that urban planning and urban life might be affected, might be changed. But honestly, how serious are politicians and urban planners about using the pandemic to ensure that the city recovery is green, is really sustainable?
Well, in my experience, this commitment is very real. I think that with COP26 coming this year in Glasgow, with increasing pressure from citizens, from investors, and from competition in this space, that there is an accelerated race towards net zero. And all of the actors at the political level and the business level want to see rapid progress made. The inhibitors here, of course, are to do with the cost of the transition. We know that in the long term, the transition to net zero is one that is profitable. But in the short term, of course, it requires injections of capital and cash, and some can afford that more than others. Let's take one example. If you look at central business districts and you look at the office buildings within them, the pattern of ownership that we've looked at in central London suggests that some of the owners are much more ready to accelerate investment in net green or net zero via green investment than others are. So we will see, I think, some patchiness in this. But that's why it's very important that regulation and policy is strong to create a level playing field. And that's why it's also important that financial institutions are ready to respond to the opportunity and provide financing that meets the investment and return cycle of net zero investment.
Thank you. Gerte, over to Amsterdam. Do you have any concrete examples? More green spaces, more people-centric streets?
Yeah, absolutely. We see that there is much more money, but also requests from residents. And I think in the future, visitors alike, to have more public space that is more green. So there is already a plan for a new park. There are huge plans, and that speeded up. I think COVID stopped some things and also speeded up some processes. So this process of getting the car out of the city center, getting more, we have bike streets. That is a normal street, but where bikes have the main power and cars are guests. So you see that speeding up as well. You see an enormous speed up of people not having cars anymore in the city center and sharing, but you also see it in the business part. We just launched our new plan on attracting conventions, and it's all about sustainability and innovation. And that's also the request from the clients. We see it, the most popular hotel last summer, when we had a sort of opening up between lockdown 1 and 2, the most successful hotel was the most sustainable hotel because people like it. And I think the good thing is what I think Greg said as well, that as cities, we are all so different, but we're all so alike. And the good thing is if we start to be in competition on this social sustainability and environmental sustainability, we will force politicians and businesses to invest in that as well. And I hope within 5 years, the economic benefit of a social and ecological sustainable business, city, whatever, will be much, much more clear, because that will be the most important power for transition, I guess.
Herbert, do you have any concrete examples of green initiatives taken in Vienna?
There have been several examples, from pop-up bike lanes to other examples we have currently, or just yesterday, a program of about 80 million euros was introduced to help the city districts to introduce green measures, to introduce measures that help to adapt climate change. So these things are happening on an operational level, but things are also happening on a strategic level. In the midst of the pandemic, a new city government was introduced, and the ambition for reaching net zero were even increased, because now we have the goal of being a net zero in 2040. Before that, it was 2050. So there is a new kind of ambition, and that's why we're now currently in the process of revising the smart city strategy of the city of Vienna, which was first introduced in 2016 and then revised 2019 and then now again revised to fit with these new political goals, which are obviously very ambitious. The other second issue on a strategic level is that resilience as a political concept, as a strategic concept, as a concept of urban development has gained in importance, and it will be also included in our smart city strategies. And the understanding of resilient cities as a cornerstone, and resiliency as a cornerstone of successful cities has increased dramatically. And I think that is also one of the results of the learnings of the pandemic.
Thank you. Vincent, the 15-minute city concept or model is being discussed all over, and this comes from Paris, and it's being discussed as a step towards a more sustainable city. Would you like to elaborate a bit on that?
Yes, thank you. Yes, Paris wants to become the city of neighborhoods, where you can find everything you need within 15 minutes on foot or by bike from home. If you come to Paris, or when you can come to Paris, you will be maybe surprised by the number of new bike streets or bike lanes set up in the city of Paris, but also in suburbs. This objective of the 15-minute city requires rethinking the use of certain number of existing facilities, such as schoolyards, and imagine new ones such as citizen kiosk or social sport clubs. And we observe that this concept is put in place in the city of Paris, but also in some specific city close to Paris in suburbs. But we have some debate sometimes because you have to keep in mind that this concept is discussed by specialists, but also by officials, because its implementation sometimes results, the consequences of this implementation of the model of the city of, of the 15-minute city, create amenities that want inhabitants. So they are happy about that. But at the same time, this new amenity creates some problems for commuters from suburbs and sometimes for tourists. So we have to put around the table, of course, the inhabitants, but also because we are a global city, but also employees, visitors, and also real estate investors to define with all of them how to implement more services close to residential area or in business in residential area, but also in business districts.
Thank you, Vincent. We organized this seminar because we want to learn from other cities. That is why I would like to ask you all, if you were to formulate one key takeaway message from you to Stockholm, do this, take this initiative, focus on this, and you will be ahead of the curve. You will develop in a sustainable, in a good way. What would that be? Starting with you, Greg.
Well, for me, I think it's the really obvious point that we have to treat the pandemic as an invitation to rebuild trust and social capital in the city. It's very clear from what Vincent and Herbert and Geerta have said that the adjustments that are required in our cities to optimize the benefits and to minimize the risks are all adjustments that require citizen participation, they require social capital, and they require trust. The city that is able to emerge from the pandemic successfully is one that really induces its citizens to remake the city, not simply the city planners or the transport planners to do it. So I think this is the key thing, that we have to have a new partnership with citizens which is about innovating to make the city work in the post-pandemic world. And I'm very confident that these 5 cities that are involved in this conversation will do that. By the way, I think this is where Europe has a big advantage over the rest of the world, because by some margin, European cities have much higher social capital than the social capital levels we find in the Americas or in Asia Pacific.
Thank you, Greg. Over to you, Geerta. Anything we in Stockholm should steal with pride from Amsterdam?
Yeah, I can only add to what Greg just said. Again, I really believe in the multifunctionality of cities in the broader perspective, but also in neighborhoods, streets, and even within companies. We, for instance, see hotels that are post offices now, so they have a function to the residents as well. We have hotels that have working places now on several floors to get this intercreation. That is one. Invest with this vision on ecological and social sustainability, so it really becomes more sustainable in different ways, and do it in co-creation. And I hope as cities together we invest as well on European level, because I think if we invest, for instance, in more sustainable accommodation, travel, services, etc., all together, we will benefit as Europe.
Herbert, what can Stockholm learn from Vienna?
Well, probably our holistic understanding of sustainability and the smart city is a good case in point, because it's not only about ecological sustainability and economic sustainability, it's also about social sustainability and social inclusion. And I think Vienna is is a good city in terms of providing a high level of social inclusion. I mentioned social housing as one of the pillars of that system, but there are others also, and that is especially in times of a crisis like the one we're in now. As a high level of social inclusion can help us to navigate through this crisis much better. And I think that's in general a positive feature of European cities, and probably especially of Vienna. And the second thing is that's probably not something that Vienna is already doing good, but a general advice would be that I think we have to think and discuss the balance between market solutions and public involvement or public intervention. So to discuss more in detail, where does the market provide the solutions we like in terms of our sustainability goals, and where do we have, as a city or as public entities or public institutions, where do we have to intervene in one way or another to secure solutions which are beneficial for the whole society?
Thank you. And Vincent, what can a city with huge ambitions such as Stockholm learn from a world global hub like Paris?
I think that the pandemic is a midterm problem. The problem is ecological transition, digital transformation of cities is a long-term transformation. So I think you have to think the future and imagine the future, create representation of the future, and when you have defined your vision at long term, you can find the way, the path to this vision. So that's we are try to put in place in Paris region. We think that in 20 years, the situation will be very different in global cities. So for us, the key answer is transportation, because by the transportation you can help the mobility of people without the consequences that you observe today with the emission of carbon. So you have to invest a lot in transportation. That means, of course, public transportation, but also transportation, active mobility, in fact. And the second objective for us is to involve, as Greg said, we have to involve citizens. We have to involve people in the planning, in the strategy for the city, for the neighborhood, for business district, because people are key. You build city for people, not for machine. So that's why we try to change our mind in France, because in France sometimes we are too we are modeled by engineer, and we have to think much more people and to engage people in the recreation, the reinvention of Paris and its suburbs.
Thank you all. I know that we are running out of time. I would just like to ask one last question to Greg. You said something about that we have reasons to be optimistic about European cities in the wake of the pandemic. Would you like to say a few words more on that topic?
Well, it's very easy to look at European cities in a global context and to say, we're not as big or powerful or as the Asian cities, and we're not as entrepreneurial and innovative as the American cities, and therefore, what's the future of European cities? And for people to be generally pessimistic about Europe. But the point I'm trying to make is this, that I think the pandemic has revealed and accelerated a whole series of imperatives that Vincent and Hirta and Herbert have been talking about, where actually this is an opportunity to play to the strengths of European cities. Agile populations, good planning, a focus on climate and resilience, and overall this ability to use a partnership between citizens and cities and governments and businesses to reinvent cities actively around a values set, which is about livability, resilience, sustainability, agility, all of these things we've been talking about. In this regard, I think Europe has an advantage, a competitive advantage against other cities in other parts of the world, and we must seize this as an opportunity to position European cities as the pioneers of the post-pandemic city.
Thank you so much, Greg, for that. The future of European cities is bright. Thank you all for listening and joining us today. Thank you to our eminent speakers for being with us next time in Stockholm, hopefully. Bye for now.